There's a paper you wrote on constitutional changes of government in Africa. What implications for democratic consolidation? And you say this paper also advances the argument that military takeovers will remain a viable source of democratic regression on the continent, in as much as insufficient efforts are made to deal with their predisposing factors, especially bad governance in all its ramifications. I know in the paper you touched some elements that constitute the unconstitutional takeover of power. Can you throw more light on this, especially in light of the current coups that happened in West Africa, and if you are seeing the continent falling into more coups d'etats in the days ahead?
Okay, thank you so much, Mr. Moderator. It's very interesting to know that I wrote that paper in 2011. I think it was published in 2011. And as at that time, based on certain considerations, I came to that conclusion that going forward, that we may continue to witness the resurgence of military coups on the continent of Africa, and that is exactly what we have been witnessing the last couple of years now. And I think for me, the explanation for that lies in the deepening crisis and contradiction, not just of governance, but even of the state in itself in Africa. And this point I want to make about the African state connects to the point by Professor Carroll's on the form and character of the African state. The key issue for me is the fact that development is not on the political agenda of the current political elites across different countries in Africa. And when any country does not, as a matter of deliberate policy, okay, I mean, you have to be intentional about it to make development a cardinal principle of the political agenda. As long as development is not critical, is not central to the political agenda of those elites of power, these are the kind of tendencies we're going to continue to experience. And I think the greatest manifestation of that lies in my earlier analogy about what I call democratic disequilibrium on the continent. That democracy promised so much, okay, at inception, okay, under this third wave. And people embraced it because they made a lot of promise to them that once you have democracy, every other thing, development will follow. But decades down the line, the reverse is the case. So there is a kind of gap, a mismatch, okay, between the promise of democracy and what democracy has been able to deliver. And that gap is what I call democratic disequilibrium. You know, in ordinary demand and supply theories, you know, once there is disequilibrium, there will be crisis. So what we are witnessing now is a manifestation of the instability of the crisis as a result of democratic disequilibrium, the mismatch between the demand for democracy and the supply of democracy. So all those things are deeply rooted in the deepening crisis and contradiction of governance on the continent. And of course, there are so many dimensions to that deepening crisis and contradiction of governance. But for me, the key foundation of that is the crisis of the state. Can we actually, which country can you look at in Africa now and speak of that country as a state in the real sense of that term? Because when you speak about a state, there are certain defining attributes of a state, okay? But by the time you begin to pick all those attributes of a state one by one, and you begin to relate them to different African countries, I'm not sure how many countries we actually qualify as state in the real sense of the term on the continent. So, and what does that tell us? It's simply showing that most of the things we refer to as states in Nigeria, they are just geographical political entities, okay, for the accumulation of resources. And that was why when my brother was talking about cybersecurity and you were talking about opposition, I just smiled. It's not a question for the opposition, whether it is opposition or those in government. The development agenda is very, very low if you have it at all on their political agenda. And once that gap is there, it's going to be difficult to move the state forward. So most of the states in Africa, they lack the capacity in every sense of that term You know, when you speak about state capability, there are different dimensions to it: military capability, technological, bureaucratic, administrative, and so on and so forth. So how many states in Africa can you point at and say, yes, in terms of bureaucratic administrative capability, that this state is top notch? How many of them? You now begin to see the kind of pathologies that the public bureaucracy is radiating across many African countries. If you go to the military, you have terrorism, different forms of insurgencies across different African countries. What have they been able to do about it? Okay, these are questions that feed into the question of state capability. Another economic component of state capability is the ability to generate resources, to generate their own fund, okay, adequately and effectively manage and administer that fund. How many African countries can generate their own fund without resorting to borrowing? Dr. Klaus made the right point. Yes, African Union, 80% of their budget comes from external donors. So in that kind of situation, you can't be the master of your own game. You have to listen to some external voices, okay, before you can take certain critical decisions about the continent. So I think for me, the point is that we are confronted with a deepening crisis and contradiction of governance on the continent. And as a result of that crisis of governance, you now see so many other things following, leading to crisis of development everywhere you turn, okay? You see structures of government everywhere, but you hardly see governance. Okay, so that is why I challenge some scholars when they speak about ungoverned spaces in terms of those territories that are not occupied by government institutions. I said we need to begin to extend that definition of ungoverned spaces beyond that in Africa, because there are so many spaces occupied by government where you see government structures, you see government institutions, you see laws, you see law enforcement agencies, and yet nothing is happening in those spaces, in those territories. So by every standard, those kind of spaces also qualified to be referred to as ungoverned spaces. And you have so many of them across so many countries on the continent. But to relate to this idea of saying that yes, most of our social structures were either imported from the metropole, okay, some of them when they got here, some they met, they were transformed. That was the argument of PPAK in his seminal article, Colonialism and the Two Publics, you know. But again, we need to begin to ask the question, several decades after the attainment of that flag independence, what have we been able to do to change the situation? And I think for me, yes, we cannot exonerate colonialism from some of these things we are seeing, because as scholars have argued, we need to understand colonialism as an epochal event, okay, whose implications transcend the borderland of the so-called attainment of political independence. We are still seeing the manifestation of the negative consequences of colonialism. That is fine. But there are many other ex-colonies too. Okay, America was also colonized. Most developed countries of the world today, they were at one time or the other under colonialism. So why is our own situation different in Africa? So we cannot continue to reify that colonial argument that because we were colonized, yes, we were colonized, and colonizing did a lot of terrible things to Africa in terms of the population, you know, taking away our resources and stuff like that. Fine. But the key point is that our political leaders, since the attainment of political independence in most African countries, the point is that they have continued to make themselves available as agents, okay, of those ex-colonial powers. And this is much more prominent in ex-French colonies, okay? And that is why when you look at those tendencies of coups that we are talking about now, virtually all the recent coups took place in ex-French colonies, okay, in Africa. And I think that has to do with the post-colonial or post-independent policies of France. There's something they call France Afrique. I don't speak French, I don't know the correct pronunciation. So, from Afrique, that is the root of some of the discontent that we are seeing in those ex-French colonies now, where those coups are happening. you now begin to see a situation where citizens are trooping to the street to celebrate military adventurism, military system of power. And what does that tell us? I want people, we should not misinterpret that to mean that people now prefer military autocracy to democracy. No, it was a spontaneous response, okay, to express their popular discontent, disaffection, okay, with the content and the delivery of democracy in those various countries. So the truth of the matter is that democracy has not delivered. The way we have it today, this liberal version has not delivered. And because of that, people are coming out to the streets to celebrate when the military seized power in those countries. But after those dust settle down, I think people are beginning to have a reconsideration that, look, yes, this is just a temporary relief. A temporary relief in the sense that if you go back to the history of military autocracy on the continent, some of them will start as revolutionary forces, but they end up as reactionary forces. So I don't know any country where you can point out under military administration that they actually transformed their countries and laid the foundation for future sustainable development in those countries. So it's a big challenge. We need to find a way of addressing the crisis and contradiction of governance on the continent. And if we don't address those contradictions, I'm afraid, because those features you saw in those countries where the military took power, you find them across virtually almost all the countries in Africa. So where the military has not taken over, it's not because those pathologies are not manifesting. Maybe the civilian administration in those countries find a way of co-opting, of integrating the military elite into that structure, of resource distribution, of state capturing and stuff like that. So we call it strategy of co-optation. So if they have been able to co-opt them into that process of national resource or asset sharing, then definitely at the top level of the military, they will continue to play along with the civilian leadership of the country. But it is a dangerous signal that someday, somewhere, somehow, there can be a breakdown in that process of co-optation and the military can strike in any part of the continent.